Hello, everyone. Welcome to another session as part of the speaker series of our UN Celebration Week. I'm Shalini Vijayagopalan, Head of Marketing at Impact Consulting Bangalore, and I am your host for today. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Sunaina Bamra. An SDG consultant with the UNICEF is just a phrase that explains everything that she brings to this conversation. But she's so much more than that. A postgraduate in development policy from the Graduate Institute Geneva, she's extensive expertise in education curriculum and frameworks. A former Teach for India fellow, her grassroots level experience makes her an expert in impact assessment in education. Sunaina, over to you to please introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Shalini. And I feel like you've given quite an illustrious introduction. So not really much else to say. I graduated from the Graduate Institute Geneva in Masters in Development Studies, where I focused on migration and education. And education is something that's always been close to my heart. As you mentioned, I was also a Teach for India fellow for 2 years, where I taught girls in a government school in Delhi, which was a great learning experience. And even before that, I had volunteered in 2015 with Teach for India. So it's always been a journey with teaching. Apart from that, I was also working as an intern with the United Nations Reliefs and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, which was during COVID in 2020. So I was really helping them make COVID consolidation plans and emergency plans for skill training. So that was, again, a very great learning experience for me. And therefore, I think working with the UN and then working with fields on ground and organizations really help you to learn a lot more about the sector. I also moderated with the UN Geneva for the UN Peace Week. So that was a great experience as well. Now I'm working, like, as you mentioned, as an SDG consultant to draft the SDG document for Rajasthan, where I work with UNICEF and the government of Rajasthan.
Wow.
So that's about me.
An amazing intro. I mean, it's so fascinating, such level of deep impact projects. I'm sure you're very proud. Before we get into anything a little detailed, considering that this is a UN Celebration Week theme, and I know you live the UN principles of sorts, I mean, on a regular basis, but just would be nice to hear from you, what does that UN Day of sorts mean? How does that have an impact? And apart from the regular layman like us, what does that mean for you?
Well, I think each and every one of us lives with the ideas and the vision of the UN, which is to really bring peace and justice to society. And we do it in our own ways, of course. But I think every one of us has that strand of compassion that we live with each and every day. And I hope that has really been maximized during COVID, that we really want to help each other. But the UN as a symbol is a symbol of peace, and as a symbol of justice, is a symbol of advocacy. What the UN does is that it really brings all the nations together, right? And it focuses on how to bring maximum justice, how to address the challenges that are happening around the world. We saw that the WHO was really on top when COVID happened. We see that the UN is really on top with climate justice, whether it's Paris Agreement or anything else. So I really feel that the UN is, when it started as League of Nations, it started with the idea of really bringing countries together and having one agenda, one vision, which is a vision for peace. Now we see that the UN has also come up with sustainable development goals. Before, there was Millennium Development Goals as well. And that is with the idea of every country setting targets to achieve peace, to achieve justice, to achieve everything in terms of proper institutions, right-based framework. So the UN is really important, in my opinion. The UN, we can all see, has a lot of impact in terms of bringing advocacy and change. And more young people, I think, want to join the UN and want to do something about the world, want to change the world. And I feel like they look up to the UN in that way. So I feel like it's also something for the youth as a target, as a place to really look up to, get inspired by. So definitely the UN, we should celebrate the UN every single day. Obviously, there are certain challenges to the UN as well, in terms of, how much more it could do. But I feel like overall, it is a symbol of peace. It is a symbol of diversity. It is a symbol of justice.
Wow, that's really inspiring, especially for the youth in terms of where it could really bring everybody together. Since you just
Right.
mentioned that it's inspiring for the youth, I'm going to touch upon something personal for you. What was that point or that inspiration that led you into this journey? I mean, at very young age, TFI fellow, that's not something that everybody really does. And you have seemed to have done a lot of your education also in the space of policy, social impact, etc. So what was the trigger for that?
Well, I think I've always been a purpose and mission driven person. And even in school, I used to volunteer a lot, which is not to say that, I just did it as a lip service to society. I think it's always been something that's close to my heart. And well, when I was in school, it really motivated me to work harder towards really doing something for children. I think children and women really motivate me to work harder. And I feel like there's a lot that needs to be done in our country. And especially, I keep on mentioning COVID because COVID has had great impact on our society, especially poor children, poor women. So definitely, I think it was more about taking in my experiences and learning and understanding that change and high level impact, strong impact is what I want to create in the society. And that's when I joined various organizations before I joined Teach for India. And I've always been involved in volunteer work. Even during COVID, I was involved with an organization where where we distributed care packages to more than 4,000 migrant laborers who were taking Shramik trains back to their homes in Bihar and Jharkhand, etc. So I think there's not, if we all do our bit, we can really change the world. And it really just means that we need to get up and do something about it. And even if you don't want to get up now, everything is on your phone. So you just look up the best organizations that are there and, you just help in whatever way you can. But as long as you have that idea and that strain that you want to help people. So that's where I come from. I think for me, helping people is the most important thing. And what is life without really having a purpose to do something? So, yeah.
Purposes are great, but they also, I'm sure, come with a whole lot of challenges. So, especially in the social space, it wouldn't have been easy at all. And each of the assignments that you've done, Teach for India, the policy, etc., I'm sure comes with its own set of challenges in terms of uh, connecting with both sides of the spectrum and helping them both understand why what you're recommending is better for everyone. So how has that challenge been? How have you been able to overcome those?
I think the biggest challenge is the fact that we enter the social space with our own set of ideas. And we think that our context is the same context as the context of children that we are going to work with. That is the biggest challenge because you need to unlearn so many things when you really start working with people who may not come from the same backgrounds as you do. So you really need to empathize, and more than empathize, you really need to unlearn for yourself that, listen, I'm entering this space and I'm not going to get this, and it's not going to work according to me. And me myself is not important. What is important is what these children want. So what do these children want? And really understanding, what do these children want? What does the community want? What are the challenges within the community? Where people really fail is to understand that context. And this is not only people, these are organizations. This is even like larger sectors, public sector. We make policies on a macro level, but we often forget what the local context of those policies may be. So this is the biggest challenge I feel that every person who's a development practitioner faces. Other than that, within just like navigating the government sector, I feel like is quite a challenge, and it's a learning experience for sure for everybody. We speak about how difficult the government can be, but at the same time, how much you learn from it is really, it takes you places. You learn so much about how people are, how things work, how files get sent out, how bureaucracy works, even bureaucracy in the UN. So on that front, definitely that is a challenge that is an area of development that you really like just hone for yourself. With children and with communities that we work with, like I said, the biggest challenge is context, and the other challenge is to really have patience, because there are This is a very small example, but when I was teaching kids, 41 children asked me a question at the same time, and they all wanted an answer within the same second. So you're just looking at all the children, and you're like, okay, this means this, 5 into 7 is this is the division, this is the, so I think just really connecting with children, connecting with people, you need to have a lot of patience, you need to understand a lot more. But those are also very primary things, and things that you can obviously hone for yourself. Other than that, I think you just enjoy the experience. Every challenge, with every challenge, you learn a lot, and you just need to go in with the mindset that you're going to enjoy this. And so that's what I did. And I really thoroughly enjoyed all the years that I've spent, whether it's 2 years with TFI or any other years working with the Delhi government or with the UN. It was a great experience. And now onwards and upwards, taking every challenge as it comes.
Lovely. That sounds great. That's essentially the best mindset for challenges in terms of taking it out with that kind of a spirit and then trying to make the most of the situation. Before we get into the UN SDG on the quality of education, education is a word that gets used very loosely by people. So before we get into understanding that, I'd want to understand your definition of education, just sort of taking a step back from the typical definitions of primary, secondary, grade, etc. Holistically, what does that 12 to 14 years mean to a child in terms of where do you leave the child with that education? Would love to hear your view on that.
So if you look at education in other countries, let's say the Finland model, which is the most celebrated model of education in the world, what do? They don't put their children into preschool when they turn 4 or 3 or 4. They give children until 5 years to really play. And then children go into school and everything is activity based. And there are teaching learning models which really cater to differentiated interests of students. As opposed to India, once you're in school, you're only learning to pass that 12th board exam. So the biggest challenge in our country is to really shift the mindset of learning and of education from learning to learn to memorize for 12 board exams to really learning to apply those skills, learn skills and do something about it, whether you are an entrepreneur eventually or whether you are in a job. And that mindset shift needs to come in, which is how our education is going to be defined in the longer next generations in the future, right? Currently, if I have to really speak about the definition of education, it's literally just a traditional, very antediluvian model of learning, which focuses on rote memorization, not to reduce the things that are happening, the changes that are taking place. Let's say we have our national education policy as well, but this is the challenge that NEP also looks at, the challenge of rote memorization of 12 board learning. Now, if all the countries, including China, are moving towards a skill-based model, why are we still focused on a traditional approach? So education really needs to take into account skill-based learning. We have this thing called 21st century skills. These 21st century skills are critical thinking skills, they're creative skills, they are decision-making skills, skills to apply whatever you are learning. We have to start learning, we have to start teaching those skills to our children, whether it's offline mode of learning or online mode of learning. In any capacity or modality, these are the things that we really should be focusing on right now. So a holistic education will really just, in simple words, ensure and reinforce children to apply what they have learned. And that is the definition that I want to go with, because we obviously have various definitions of what learning and what education is, but learning is lifelong. And we really need to know how to apply that lifelong learning.
Lovely. So now just diving straight into the quality of education. As a country, where do we stand on our quality of education, the parameters that get defined? Where do we stand as a nation?
Well, We have made some changes in the education sector, and every state considering education is a concurrent subject. So the center and the state are in tandem with each other in terms of bringing in change within the education sector. And I feel like a lot of states are doing very well. Pre-COVID numbers suggest, according to the NSSO survey, that there were 30.2 million children who were out of school. And this is a pre-COVID statistic. So most of the children were male in primary grades and secondary grades, but from upper primary onwards, a lot of girls start dropping out. And why does that happen is because of various reasons that we can attribute to, let's say, the school is not in close proximity to their house. There is not an operational latrine facility. So girls obviously start menstruating around that age and therefore don't feel like the environment is conducive. There are other factors like care work. As girls keep on growing up, they get into more care work at home. So there are various factors that I think especially affect women a lot more than men, but also boys are dropping out and are getting into labor as well. So obviously the entire socioeconomic element is present in education, especially when we talk about education of poorer populations. Other than that, I think a lot of these children come from backward classes. So India makes up of 33% of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe population that is out of school, which is the most number. And scheduled tribes make up for the most number of students that are out of school. This is a really stark and glaring number, and we need to talk about it because we only focus on children who can afford an education, but what about children who may not have access to a good education? And so what are we doing about them? What are we doing about out of school children? We are addressing this stuff in policy, but we really need to get on action and really start working on it. And there are obviously there are states who have Kasturba Gandhi Vidyalayas, who have ashram hostels, etc., for the educationally backward blocks. But we really need to get this more into the forefront of education and how we need to address these ideas. Now, if we look at COVID, I think COVID has definitely, as I mentioned, exacerbated the entire crisis for us. And this can be seen as many people left school. And this was also a direct, segue into how midday meal stopped. Now, midday meal got disrupted for over 120 million children. 120 million children were benefiting from the world's largest school feeding program, which is the midday meal, or now PM Poshan scheme. Now, those 120 million children don't have access to food. I'm sure they do at their homes, but many of them don't. And they were coming to school to have this lunch that was provided, out of which 96% of these children who are most affected are, again, from scheduled caste and scheduled tribe. So the numbers are very stark when we look at children, especially children who come from backward backgrounds. And I bring this up again because we really don't talk about it much. We talk about children who really come from a particular sect of the society, but we don't talk about children who need to be really now brought into the forefront. Another statistic that I would like to mention is just the access to internet facilities. Now, out of the 28% of the most poorest households, only 2.7% had access to a device for remote learning. Only 2.7%. And 96% again of these children came from SC/ST backgrounds who had no access. So we speak about access, and only 6% children had access to internet services pre-COVID. So it's not like really working on internet and bringing networks and really encouraging children to use online devices, training teachers to do the same has been our priority ever. But taking into account the crisis and how we are shifting towards a blended mode of modality of learning, it's become the need of the hour more than anything else to bring everything online. But how can we do that if there is such a big disparity in terms of online learning, in terms of access to device? Schools do not have computer labs. Our children don't have devices. There's a big challenge that's looming over all of us. And ultimately, you send something on WhatsApp or there's online learning, but that's only being catered to a select few in metropolitan cities. So this is the biggest challenge I feel. I think apart from the other challenges, infrastructural and curricular challenges that exist in our country and obviously have been exacerbated because of COVID-19. But really, how are how are children going to even learn if they don't even have basic access to facilities? We used to talk about physical access, but now it's shifted to online access. And how do we do that? So that's a definitely a very big challenge that needs to be addressed. And overall, in our education parameters, I think I would like to point out that states have done really well in terms of dealing and finding solutions during COVID, especially. Whether it was the Delhi government that started sending WhatsApps and hosting live sessions, they had a lot of YouTube videos that were going out, which were used by 60 million children across the country. So that was a great effort that was made by the Delhi government. Then the Rajasthan government started hosting, and it was one of the first states, in fact, that started broadcasting lessons on Doordarshan and on the radio, Akashvani. So there are states that have adopted, I can only speak for North India, but there are states that have adopted quickly and adapted quickly, but much more needs to be done in terms of online education. And then when I shift to offline education, obviously overall in terms of sanitation, let's say schools, 96% of the schools in our country have access to an operational latrine facility according to UDICE data. Now, I believe that, but we still see a lot of children dropping out. So where is the gap? That gap needs to be addressed. Are we looking at children again coming from rural areas, from backward areas? I did my dissertation on Kasturba Gandhi Kanya Vidyalaya, and during my time at the Graduate Institute, and the biggest really hypothesis which emerged was that there is no money in all of these schools. There is a lack of intent to not only teach, but really just give them mere access to basic facilities, give these girls access to basic facilities. And then the girls were not feeling safe in school. So, I mean, that's a different topic of discussion in terms of talking about the gender disparity of schools. And that's a huge topic as well. But overall, we need to take that into account. And in terms of the solutions, I would say, with the advent of COVID-19, what we really need to do is focus on training our teachers, focus on giving our children access to devices, access to a proper internet connection, and really start inculcating the blended modality of learning. So we really need to start focusing on how education is probably not going to be the same anymore. We may not be going to, all those states have opened up their schools, but we don't know about a third wave or whatever waves that exist. So we really need to look at how blended learning is going to work and start creating that infrastructure for it.
Building for the future of sorts.
Exactly.
So, Sunaina, you mentioned this part about gender disparity being existing, two sorts of disparities. One is at a caste level and the second at a gender level. I'm going to want to delve in a bit more into the gender piece that you mentioned, because you, as part of the TFI, you were working with a girls' school as well. So I'm sure you have a lot of insights in that space. And having worked with low-income schools and government schools, I also feel that there's a huge difference, not just in terms of ratio, but just in terms of what needs to be done for them to ensure that they're retained in terms of dropouts, just the space of the curriculum as well in terms of what do we offer them. But before we get into that, in terms of gender disparity, girls dropping out, and also a bit about the need for a bit more education in the space of menstrual health, sexual awareness. Will this make that a safer space for them in terms of being school being a safe space? What does the government, what is the education system, what's it that can be done in these spaces that can help solve for these issues?
Yeah. So I'd like to begin with the fact, and this is a fact, that India is primarily a patriarchal society. We are, there are not only in terms of statistical ratios, more men in the country. Most of those men are in leadership positions. There are more boys than girls in schools, and there are more men than women in the workforce. So if we really have to look at, for example, the World Economic Forum comes out with a gender parity index, and that gender index ranks India 140 out of 156 countries, which means that we are way, way, way behind in terms of achieving any sort of gender parity, if we ever do. And there's a big if. It's a very systemic issue, and you can't just say that there's this one thing that you can pin down that is the problem, that is the root of the problem of why women are not in any spaces and there's underrepresentation of women in the country. First of all, we need to really start shifting the mindset of our communities and our parents. The main reason for dropout of girls is not because they want to drop out themselves. It's because of the ideas that a lot of the larger community holds, that a lot of them think girls should not go to school. Then when girls do go to school, they may become too smart or may have their own opinions. They may not want to get married. Then when girls turn off age, which is they start menstruating, obviously from a school level, from a supply level, there is not enough, there may not be latrine facilities, there may not be access to sanitary napkins, there may not be access to basic education on, let's say, menstruation. On the demand side, we have parents, we have the community which are scared, which think that the girls are of age, which want to get girls married. More and more women, more and more girls who enter upper primary, secondary education are involved in care work. And we saw the number of women who are involved in care work during COVID. The statistic really came out, right? Something that we disregard completely. And we only look at professions that give us some sort of money, and care work clearly isn't a profession that is addressed or regarded in any way. So I think overall, this gender parity challenge is a very, very systemic challenge that needs to be addressed in every domain of the social sector, whether education, whether health, whether employment, mostly employment. Because what are we really doing after girls do complete 12th class education? They are either married off. Those who are not married off and come from poorer backgrounds may have lower access to opportunities, So I think it's really important that we see the entire trajectory of women get into jobs or become entrepreneurs for us to say that we've really succeeded in learning and education of women. Because the ultimate idea should be that we become financially independent and we become independent in every aspect, of what independence means. So education in general is of women widely affected. It was really a lot more affected during COVID. There are 40% of adolescent girls who are not attending school as we speak. And there are 30% of them who come from backward classes like SC/ST who have not been in a single class, attended a single session of school. The literacy rate is 20% down. The literacy rate of men is 78%, whereas the literacy rate of women is 58%, which in itself speaks volumes about how we need to work on educating women. From a qualitative perspective, and this is just a personal, take on women education, I think when I entered the government school that I was teaching in, not to reduce what the teachers were doing, I think the mindset was that, why are you as a Teach for India fellow working so hard? Ultimately, they're going to grow up and work in a salon or work as, domestic workers. And that mindset from the get-go is that they're not going to do anything in their society or do anything for themselves. They're not going to become successful. They're going to probably be married and work, depend on their husband or be in professions like domestic care. Domestic work is not a bad profession. It's something that is deeply disrespected, which I don't understand about this society, but it is a profession that doesn't pay much. So, and it is not a benchmark that we should be looking at as women who need to be, who we want more women in leadership positions, and that's it. How do we get women in leadership positions is really focusing on education. And we need to have a more gender sensitized curriculum in our schools. It's going to start with having gender mainstreaming, gender sensitized curriculums in school, which focus on stories that are also led by female characters more than men characters, that focus on various issues like you mentioned, menstruation or good touch, bad touch in stories, so that not only women but boys are also learning. And this is an issue that needs to be really, it needs to include boys as well. We can't reach a parity, we can't reach any sort of parity if we don't have boys and men involved in it together.
Absolutely.
So
Rather
let's start with a gender sensitized curriculum. Yes, let's start with a gender sensitized curriculum, and then let's focus on how to give more concessions or more opportunities, I would say, to women. And governments are doing that. We have with Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, there are state governments who've taken up various campaigns of education, not only education and information campaigns, but we have cash transfer schemes like the Ladli Yojana. So the Ladli Yojana in various states gives money to girls once they're 18 years of age and have completed their entire secondary education. And this is done with the idea of ensuring that parents don't take out their girls to get them married. So they get approximately 1 lakh or 2 lakhs once they turn 18. Then there are various interventions for girls on a state level. I can speak for Rajasthan because I was working on that SDG document, and there are various interventions in Rajasthan. Like we have a scooty scheme, so girls are given scooties in backward areas so that they can take a scooty from their home to school. Again, various cash transfers. We have the Kasturba Gandhi Kanya Vidyalaya schools, which are hostels for girls who come from all walks of life, but especially SC and ST. So the government is doing things for more on an economic and financial perspective, but we need to do something on a school level as well. We need to start really gaining making sure that people are aware of the issues and that we are doing something about it. So in Delhi, in fact, when I was in Teach for India, I had shifted to a Directorate of Education, which are schools that come under the government of Delhi. As the concept, the entire concurrent subject, MCD schools are with the central government and DOE schools are with the Delhi government. So DOE schools had tied up with NGOs, which sent people bi-weekly or once or twice in a week to really gauge women's or girl students' awareness on menstruation. So they were really teaching them everything about menstruation. And there's this anecdote that I remember when I was in school, we were talking about, we used to have certain sessions on menstrual health, on what is happening in our bodies and reproduction. And it used to be such a hush-hush topic. Everyone used to be like, oh, there's a session that's going on, so that it was a co-ed school so that boys don't get to know. And I always wondered why is it that only women get to obviously internally go through this experience, but at the same time it is a social issue and it needs to be addressed, it needs to be talked about openly, like there's nothing wrong, it's a natural phenomenon. Sadly, we still have a luxury tax on sanitary napkins, so I guess it's something that only matters to women. But coming back to the topic of educating girls in schools and really talking about taboos, another thing that works in tandem here is good touch, bad touch, are these sensitive topics of discussion in terms of when do I feel safe and when do I feel unsafe. And for that, I think the most important thing is for teachers to really connect with children. I'm not sure how many parents in poor households talk about these things and connect with their girls or daughters on these issues. But from a personal level, I always made sure that I was more of a sister as well to the students that I was teaching, so that I could really impart any sort of education or answer any sort of question. Because as growing up, we are also very scared to ask questions on periods, on menstrual health. So really, it's so important to connect with girls, because they are told in every part of their life that they shouldn't speak up, they shouldn't ask questions, they shouldn't talk about what's going on in their with their bodies, that they may be ostracized when they have their periods. And this is a practice that's followed in a lot of poor households. It's a religious practice that, you know, girls should be out of the house or in a separate room when they're on their periods. So really just giving them that attention and talking about it, answering any kind of questions that they might have without any judgment whatsoever, is what we need. And we need more NGOs to step in into government schools and work, because I think a lot of NGOs are doing phenomenally when it comes to this space. But we just really need to pay attention to our girls a lot more.
Sure, makes sense. I mean, you educate a woman, you educate the family. So, absolutely right in terms of needing more work in that space.
And you know, like you say that, I also feel like it shouldn't be, the onus should not be on women only to educate a family. We should also put that onus on a man to really bring in that kind of an education, because again, we are redirecting the entire, we are redirecting the woman and telling the woman that it is her responsibility only to ensure that the family that she is in charge of, because the personal is not political, to really take care of, you know, the family and its education. So I think, I don't know who said this, I think it was one of our philosophers, or maybe it was Gandhiji, who had said something like this, if I'm wrong, not wrong. But I genuinely feel like we should shift towards a mindset where we hold men as accountable as we hold women, in terms of educating the family, in terms of education overall, in terms of teaching the right values. Yeah.
Talking about teaching the right values, is there any scope for the curriculum to incorporate anything in the space of mental health? Because that's something that's really important, especially in these times, and especially even more for underprivileged students. So, what's the take on that space as far as qualitative education goes?
So socio-emotional learning is something that's a topic that's definitely come up now. Obviously, since all the children went into their homes and they were living in with their parents, they had no access to meeting their friends or going outside to play or just going outside overall, has really affected people's mental health. A lot more adolescents and children and adolescents who come from secondary classes and in college. Now, this is an issue that still needs to be addressed. I think the national education policy really focuses on providing social emotional learning. I can say when I was working with the Delhi government, the Delhi government has launched a new board called the Delhi School Education Board, in which the curriculum involves a proper domain of socio-emotional learning, which is cross-cutting across all other subjects. So taking into account that this is really important. Now, ASER conducted a study in 2019 on socio-emotional learning, and they found out that more than half of 6-year-olds may know how to subtract, may know their basic mathematics, but they still don't know what the 4 main basic emotions are, which is happiness, fear, anger, and sadness. So it really starts with yourself and teaching students that these are the emotions, and we really need to deal and tackle with these emotions in a way that is respectful. We really need to inculcate certain ideas and respect. And this is where I really have to give it to the Delhi government, because they've really done very well in terms of introducing the happiness curriculum. I'm not sure if the audience knows what happiness curriculum is, but happiness curriculum was started in Delhi by the Delhi government, and it really focuses on building mindfulness of children between classes 1 to 8th grade, and they're going to scale it up. But mindfulness activities focusing on meditation and ensuring that children understand what their feelings are, and really redirecting the focus to mental health. And in fact, during COVID, when happiness classes were going on online, many parents also joined happiness sessions. So this is a leaf that I would take from the Delhi government that many other states should adopt, sorry. And there are states that have spoken about it. Uttarakhand has spoken about it. I think Orissa very recently said that they want to follow the Delhi model. It's not only that I work there that I'm talking about this, it's also because I genuinely believe that these sort of interventions will really work for children and are for children's mental health, which really needs to be addressed.
It's great to hear that there's so many initiatives in this space. There seems to be at least action. Of course, needs to be more of it, but it's good to see that there starts in very responsible areas, and good to hear that. Would love to hear from you one part for the audience in terms of not everybody may have the bandwidth to play an impact in policy, may not have the bandwidth to necessarily volunteer with schools in terms of education. But you said every small thing counts. What are these small little changes that everyone could do in terms of making that small bit of an impact to ensure that we're taking the country forward in the direction of education?
Well, there's this beautiful thing called a mobile phone, and you can go on it and you can start advocating. You know, advocacy is something that can start at home, that we don't need to do much for. We're all on social media. We're all on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, every other social media that you can talk about. The most important thing that we need to do in terms of not only SDGs, but overall, I would say, and this is a personal opinion, but really just reduce the advent of fake news and fake information. And at the same time, ensure that we are informing people based on facts and, you know, the truth. Why is this important in SDGs as well? Is because if, for example, you have some fake news about a policy intervention that's taken place in education sector, and more people get to know about it, they may want to access it, they may want to benefit from it. But if it doesn't exist, then people are just wasting their time. As opposed to that, you just speak about what's happening in the country, what are your rights. I think most people that I know are not aware of what their rights are not aware of what's happening, are not aware of what certain policy interventions might be which they can benefit from. So it's not only about just using your phone to donate some money, it's also about advocating for the right thing, which I think is really important. Because, and I understand that social media can be an echo chamber, it can be an echo chamber of people that only you know, but there are many people that you know who are not aware of things either. When we work as in the development sector, this is not something that we are doing for charity. It's actually something that we want to create an impact in. And just to shift that mindset that I've done this one thing and it's enough for me to, you know, just, that's it, I've just donated something, which is a good thing. It's a start, but conscious decisions and conscious choices come from information and from advocacy of people like us who are very interested in this space. So that is something that I definitely think that people should do. And I think what was a stunning example of people coming together and community really working was during the second wave, when social media was used for the right things, which is really finding support and help for people who were suffering from COVID. All came along together to help people. And if we can just do that, it doesn't take much, you know, it didn't take much. It was just calling up people, being advocating on Twitter, advocating on Instagram. You know, these are the numbers of oxygen concentrator, people who have oxygen concentrators, this is it. So I think if we really come together as a society and as a community, even from the luxury of our phones, we can do so much in terms of advocating and helping people. All it takes is courage, all it takes is a good intent to do that. And apart from that, I think there are various organizations that are doing well, and people can always volunteer if they want to. It really takes just a phone call to get some information and start working on ground.
Well, that sounds great. It looks like impact is not really limited to the people who've taken impact to the next level, but there's a small impact that every one of us can take. So thank you so much, Sunaina, for giving your time. I really appreciate it. And thank
you so much for providing me with this opportunity. Thank you. Thank you so much for providing me with this opportunity. I think it's great to talk about these things. And, you know, us talking is also advocacy. It's also advocating for what is important in terms of the social sector. So I'm really glad that you're hosting these conversations with people who are in this space, who are doing something impactful in the space, and more such conversations need to be had.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We look forward to doing more of this. Thank you.
Thank you.